Hi, I'm William Spaniel. Let's talk about why states fight each other, or in this case, why they don't fight each other. Today's lecture is on trade, comparative advantage, and of course, war. So here are some things to kick things off. There's an empirical fact out there that countries that trade together tend not to fight wars against each other as frequently. Now, I think that this is not surprising, but it's actually kind of neat that we have this major empirical finding and we know with a pretty good degree of certainty that this is true. Now, we also have theoretical findings from the game theoretical literature in war that say that as the costs of war increase, the likelihood of war decreases. And the question for today's lecture is, can we link this theoretical idea that says as costs increase, war decreases, with the empirical fact that countries that trade together fight each other less frequently? And as it turns out, of course, the answer is yes. If the answer was no, we wouldn't have this video. So to understand what the mechanism is here, we first need to talk about why countries actually want to trade with each other. And I'm going to offer you two explanations. First, there's a diversification of products argument. So some countries can't make certain goods or just can't make them very well. And by trading, we allow for variation in products. So for an example, California makes a lot of wine because grapes are easy to grow in the Napa Valley region. And meanwhile, Mexico produces a lot of tequila. Tequila is a derivative of agave, which is a plant that grows in Mexican deserts. It's abundant in Mexican deserts. It's not that abundant in Californian deserts. It's a lot easier to grow in Mexico. So Mexico, as a consequence, makes a lot of tequila. Now, in economic terms, we say that California has an absolute advantage making wine and Mexico has an absolute advantage making tequila. It's just really easy for Californians to produce wine and difficult for them to produce tequila, whereas for Mexicans, it's easy for them to produce tequila and difficult for them to produce wine. And so in this theoretical fantasy world, let's just make up some numbers and talk about production. So if California were to just completely focus on making wine, then per man hour they could produce 10 bottles of wine, whereas Mexico could only produce 2 bottles. They'd have to spend a lot more time constructing huge orchards and trying to make sure that or vineyards, I should say, and trying to make sure that their grapes are growing properly. It's much harder for them to do that in Mexico, so they have to spend more hours to produce the same number of bottles of wine as California would. So per hour, California makes more bottles of wine than Mexico does. Now, similarly, it's the case with tequila that Mexico is better at making tequila than wine. So per man hour Mexico puts in, they get 8 bottles of tequila, whereas California per hour will only get 4 bottles of tequila. So Mexico has the absolute advantage here. Now, in practice, you don't want to just make wine or just make tequila as these countries, or as a state of California, as the country of Mexico. You want to have some diversification in your products. You would like to be able to consume both wine and tequila. So in a world without trade, it might look like this, where California spends half of its time making wine and half of its time making tequila, and Mexico also spends half of its time making wine and half of its time making tequila. And if that's the case, then in this world, California will consume 5 bottles of wine and 2 bottles of tequila, whereas Mexico will consume 1 bottle of wine and 4 bottles of tequila. But California could be like, hey, Mexico, look, here's the deal. I'll trade you 3 bottles of wine for 3 bottles of tequila. And Mexico's response would be, of course, that sounds like a great idea. And here's why. If they were to do that and they were to produce like this. So now California is just producing wine and Mexico is just producing tequila. So if that's the case, California is making 10 bottles of wine and Mexico is making 8 bottles of tequila. Then after they've made that trade, they will consume this amount. So after California makes its 10 bottles of wine and trades 3 of them to Mexico in return for 3 bottles of tequila, California consumes 7 bottles of wine and 3 bottles of tequila. And for Mexico is going to consume 3 bottles of wine and 5 bottles of tequila. Now, if we compare that to the consumption in a world without trade, which was like this, well, the world where there is trade, both parties consume more stuff. So in the world without trade, California was only consuming 5 bottles of wine. Now they're consuming 7. And they were only consuming 2 bottles of tequila. Now they're consuming 3. Mexico, meanwhile, used to be only consuming 1 bottle of wine. Now they're getting 3. And they used to be consuming 4 bottles of tequila. Now they're consuming 5. The moral of the story here is that trade is good. But that's not the only reason that you get trade. So you might think that, well, what if that weren't the case? What if California was just superior at making both tequila and wine? Why would California even bother trading with Mexico? And so I'm asking this question here. Is trade still viable if that's the case? If California is better than Mexico at everything? I'm not saying that that is true, but just suppose that there was a world where California was in fact better than Mexico at everything. Would you actually not want to trade if you were California in this case? And what we're going to see, surprisingly perhaps, is the answer is no. And that's because of a diversification of opportunity cost argument. And we'll see that in a second. This is the same idea as comparative advantage. So in this world where California is better than Mexico at producing everything, it's still the case that for an hour of work, California will produce 10 bottles of wine and Mexico will produce 2 bottles of wine. But now California is going to be better than Mexico at producing tequila as well. So if California were to put its entire hour of labor into making tequila, it would make 10 bottles of tequila, whereas Mexico would only make 8. So again, California is better than Mexico everywhere here. 10 is more than 2, 10 is more than 8. But here's a big point. Mexico pays a smaller opportunity cost for making bottles of tequila than they do making bottles of wine. So again, in practice, these countries, and Mexico and California, don't want to just consume wine and tequila. They want to consume a mixture. So if in a no trade world they were to split their labor, it would look like this. But Mexico here, by making this 1 bottle of wine, they have foregone 4 bottles of tequila, right? Because if they just make tequila, if they don't spend any time making wine, they would have gotten these 8 bottles right here. But in fact, now they want to produce some amount of wine, so they have to give up 4 bottles of tequila to do that, which is much, much more than California has to give up to make an extra bottle of wine. So to make this 5th bottle of wine, California only disregarded 1 bottle of tequila. So that's not very much. And the difference here is that California has a smaller opportunity cost for making wine, and Mexico has a smaller opportunity cost for making tequila. And the way they talk about this in the economics literature is that Mexico has a comparative advantage making tequila, despite the fact, of course, that Mexico is still worse in this hypothetical world than California is at making tequila. Now, that being the case, you still have to wonder, does trade make sense in this world? And, California might just be laughing and be like, ha ha, Mexico, we don't need you anymore. But if California were to do that, Mexico would probably laugh right back at them and be like, all right, well, let's think about this world instead. So assume we could trade. What if Mexico said, all right, California, how about this? You produce 7 bottles of wine and 3 bottles of tequila, and I'll just make tequila, because I don't pay as much of a cost of making bottles of tequila than you do. It's pretty easy for me to make tequila, and it's really hard for me to make wine. So every time I make an extra bottle of wine, I'm losing 4 bottles of tequila. So I'm just going to not make any of that wine. I'm only going to produce tequila. But here's the thing. I'm going to trade you 3 bottles of my tequila for a bottle and a half of wine. And after we've completed that trade, California was going to be like, well, this is kind of awkward because this is actually going to be better for us too. We actually do need Mexico still. And here's why. This is what happens. This is the consumption after they make that trade. So California gets 5.5 bottles of wine, 6 bottles of tequila. Mexico gets 1.5 bottles of wine, 5 bottles of tequila. That's better for both parties than it was in the world without trade. We can see that here, and especially when we make this comparison. So 5.5 is better than 5, 6 is better than 5, 1.5 is better than 1, 5 is better than 4. Everybody won again. Despite the fact that California was better at making both products than Mexico, California still actually wants to trade with Mexico. The conclusion is that trade is still good. So what do we conclude about that? Well, even if one country is better than making everything than another country, they can still improve by specializing in what they're comparatively better in. So in the previous example, Mexico specialized in making tequila because they were comparatively better at making tequila than California was, and California was comparatively better at making wine than tequila compared to Mexico, of course. So California made more wine than they did tequila, and because because of this comparative advantage and this higher opportunity cost Mexico faced for making bottles of wine, they ended up actually finding trade agreements that left both parties better off. So to conclude, why does this matter when we're talking about war? Well, war between two states becomes less likely as the cost of war rises. That's just a theoretical finding. Think about this from my position, though. If I go to war with one of my trading partners, we're not going to be able to trade with each other while we're fighting. So I'm going to lose those gains from trade. Regardless of whether I had an absolute advantage in both categories or if I just had a comparative advantage in both categories, doesn't matter. I'm still going to benefit from trading with you. But if I am not trading with you because I'm fighting with you, I'm losing out on those gains from trade. And so war is actually being costly for me, or more costly for me than if I just didn't trade with you at all normally. And so what we ultimately conclude here is that war should be less likely among trading partners than non-trading partners, just because war is more costly for trading partners than non-trading partners. And this is a really, I think, neat theoretical finding that links up to the empirical fact, and everything just works out very nicely here. That wraps up this video. I'll catch you next time.